Thanks everyone who's joining us this evening. My name is Shweta Kothari and you're watching The Argumentative Indians. At the White House reception to celebrate Eid on 2nd of May, the US President Joe Biden said that Muslims are globally being targeted with violence. Well, this certainly seems to be the case with news reports about state oppression, social ostracism, hate crimes, and mob violence around the world increasing day after day. Now, Muslims seems to be the target of discriminatory policies ranging from a radical profiling in the US to CEAA and the hijab bans across Europe and in India. So is global Islamophobia real? That, of course, is going to be our big talking point for the. All right, joining me today is Professor Khaled Beydoun. He's the law professor at Wayne State University, a scholar in residence at Harvard University, author of critically acclaimed book, American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear. Thanks very much, Professor, for taking time out. I want to first begin by asking you, and I think that's one question that's pertinent to a lot of people here in India and globally, of course, is the global Muslim community under siege? Because that's the assertion that's been made by many observers and across country for that matter. What is your take on the kind of Islamophobia that we're seeing today in India and globally, as a matter of fact?
Yeah, Shweta, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you about this really important topic. Is the global Muslim population under siege? I think that's, to be frank with you, like a simplistic assessment of what's happening on a global scale. I think Muslims at large are being scapegoated by different regimes, by different political parties, politicians, political factions. And in some places, they are under siege. If you look at what's happening in China, for instance, with the Uyghur Muslim population, I would, qualify and classify the persecution that population is experiencing as under siege. If you look at what's happening in India, for instance, where, Modi and the BJP regime are, casting not only Indian Muslims, but Muslims from a range of other countries, Muslims in Kashmir, across the board as immigrants, terrorists, as a consequence of being Muslim, not assimilable into Indian identity. I would classify what's happening in India, or what I call Indian Islamophobia, as, Muslims being under siege in that context. In the United States, it's more complex. In France, I think it's more, nuanced as a consequence of what's happening there. But I'm excited to have this conversation to make this, sort of interrogate the distinctions, but also the common denominators between Islamophobia across national contexts.
Mm-hmm. And what, according to you, Professor, is causing this selective targeting of Muslims? Because as you rightly pointed out, from China to India to Europe to Canada, it's happening across countries. What exactly is causing it? Because we know for a fact that this is not recent. This is not happening today as of 2022. It's been happening for a while. But what exactly do you think is the root cause of it?
There's a range of causes. I would say the most salient and most potent cause is the global war on terror, right? So we're 2 decades, 21 years into a global war, an American crusade that was launched after the 9/11 terror attacks, whereby, for the young people in the room, you may not remember, President George W. Bush, 10 days after the 9/11 terror attacks, gave this really important speech. It's essentially remembered as the War on Terror speech, where he basically declared to the world, you're either with us or against us. And as a consequence of, that dictate, that declaration, the Bush administration, and then following him, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and so on, basically gallivanted across the world, enlisting, governments across the world to be allies and enlistees in this global war on terror. And what the war on terror did with regard to global Islamophobia, 2 really important things. Number one, it encouraged other governments to enact laws or to intensify laws and policies to crack down on Muslim populations, Muslim communities in their own countries. And then second, it mainstreamed and globalized this, language, this counter-terror language, whereby it became okay for governments, it became okay for pundits on media stations, it became okay for individuals using social media and on the ground to classify Muslims en masse as terrorists. That language, that vocabulary came directly from the American war on terror that became a global crusade. And that's how we basically have, we come to the circumstance we're at today, where Islamophobia, which in many respects wasn't an American, advent, but it was sort of an American product that facilitated and expanded and intensified pre-existing Islamophobic projects in places like France, India, China, and so on. So when you have the primary global superpower, my country, the United States, saying it's okay to call Muslims terrorists, it's okay to persecute and punish Muslims, then governments across the world are going to follow suit.
Absolutely. And, something that's happened particularly in India, and I think we can draw parallel with the rest of the world also, is that Muslims for a very long time have been treated as invaders, people who came in from the outside, took away the wealth, did not settle down, which is much contrary to what is history. And that has been the narrative. The narrative has been that this section of people are not an integral part of this country. Is that something that is seen as a parallel in other countries? Is that the reason why perhaps we see more Islamophobia today as opposed to what was about 50 years ago?
Oh, definitely so. And I think that, again, it's really important when we talk about Islamophobia to sort of break it down and to discuss it very carefully and neatly to every distinct national context, right? So in India, Muslims are indigenous. They've been there for centuries. However, the danger in India is you have, Hindutva supremacy, this vision that was, outlined by the RSS many decades ago, racializes Muslim identity. It says that Islam is less so a faith, right? It's less so a religious ideology. It's more so a race. And as a consequence of racializing Muslim identity and also racializing Hindu identity, that's a cornerstone of the Hindutva vision, is that to be Indian is to be Hindu. So there's this conflation of ethnic and religious identity that we see in the Hindu context, but also in the Muslim context. This, as a consequence of racializing Islam and Muslim identity, it's very easy for ideologues who push that narrative to say that Muslims are not indigenous, they're foreigners, they're immigrants, they're trespassers, they're interlopers. And you get this very same language of racialized xenophobia in places like Europe, right? In France, obviously, you can take, the xenophobic, Islamophobic language used against Muslims in India, and it's used verbatim in places like France by politicians like Marine Le Pen or Eric Zemmour, right? The fringe right candidate who ran for the executive seat in that country months ago. The very same language coming out of Germany. In some respects, the very same language coming out of here in the United States with Trumpism. So this, and I think I'm really glad you bring that up, Shweta, because one sort of like common link that ties countries across the world with regard to their private Islamophobic rhetoric is this broader notion that Muslims are foreigners, they're intruders, and more than just that, they're foreigners and intruders who are sort of endangering the social and civilizational fabric of societies.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Beydoun, are these movements feeding off each other? Because as you rightly pointed out, there's a similar sort of narrative that is in India, in Europe. And do you think this is happening because these movements are feeding off each other? Because as my understanding as a journalist in this country particularly goes, is that you need to find a common enemy in case you want to come back in power. You need to obviously make the majority happy, and you need to bring them together. And the only way you do that is when you find a common enemy. Is that the reason why these movements perhaps are feeding off each other, or are these secluded, indigenous to each country?
Well, they definitely feed off of each other, right? I think that, we can look at, global populism, this notion that politicians are exploiting and then weaponizing xenophobia and Islamophobia for pointed political objectives. I mean, if you look at Trump, for instance, right? So in the United States, when Trump won the presidency in 2016, he clearly identified and then weaponized Islamophobia as a full-fledged campaign tactic. His popularity rose considerably when he, announced the proposal to ban Muslims in December of 2015. This was also the case for Modi in 2014, before he won the prime ministership in India, by virtue of sort of anointing and then declaring Muslims the civilizational threat of Hindus in India. His popularity skyrocketed, and he's maintained his popularity, if not increased it, as a consequence of perpetually or by proxy with other BJP leadership, spewing anti-Muslim hate to maintain his political prowess in that country. That's also true across Europe, right? With people like Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England, the UK, Le Pen, obviously, not even Le Pen, who's considered a far right populist, but Macron, right? Macron is also engaged in ideas that we have to reform Islam and Muslim identity to sort of rescue and maintain the integrity of French society and civilization. This very rhetoric was also used in places like Myanmar in Asia, right, where a Buddhist regime, looked toward Rohingya Muslims, the ethnic minority population in that country that was persecuted for many years, as a political scapegoat, and obviously most nefariously in places like China, where a Han supremacist communist regime demonizes Muslims as terrorists for purposes of maintaining their power. So across the board, regardless of whether we're talking about the largest democracy in the world, which India proclaims to be, or the most prominent communist regime in places like China, or a secular democracy in places like France, Islamophobia ties these governments together as a useful political tool to elevate and then maintain political regimes.
Mm-hmm. And the idea that you need to reform a certain community and therefore impose upon them what you think are the right sort of laws. For example, I want to take your attention to the hijab ban in India and in France. Of course, there's parallels across the world. And one of the narrative that we saw coming in from the ruling government across different countries is that, look, this basically, it derides women of their right to wear what they want to wear, and women are essentially oppressed in Islam, and that's the reason why they're asked to wear, or they're told to wear a certain hijab or a certain clothing which needs to protect them from the evil eyes of the men, and therefore there is a need to rescue these women, and that sort of is the common narrative that we hear of, especially in India, when we talk about such sudden laws or such sudden diktats from the ruling government that you tomorrow want to ban hijab, because that perhaps is essentially not tying in with the reforms that we want to see happening in the country. How do you respond to these people? How do you respond to these arguments?
Well, look, these arguments are very hollow, and after 21 years of global war on terror, you see just how disingenuous these arguments are. Look, if the genuine objective was to save Muslim women from oppression, right? Why don't we see American, European, and Indian saviors going into places like Yemen, the poorest nation in the Middle East that is being ravaged by COVID, cholera, Saudi Arabian bombs, where women are being, oppressed by these external factors. Why isn't there no impulse and no rush to save Muslim women from Yemen? Why is there no impulse and no rush to save, Muslim women in Afghanistan now, right after the Taliban have taken over all over again, right? Because the objective of war is over and because the resources have been taken from this country. Look, let's be honest. I think that I would be naive to say that, oppression and subordination of women doesn't take place within Muslim communities. That is existent, right? But the problem is when you construct that as the only narrative, when you construct that as the sole monolithic experience of women within the broader Islamic experience. And there is no singular Islamic experience. There's a range of practices, schools of thought. There are secular Muslims, there are Sufis, there are Sunnis, there are, everything. So the way in which Muslim women experience faith is dramatically distinct. Now, what these governments that want to criminalize the hijab are doing is essentially saying, we are cherry picking, we are handpicking this singular narrative of the Muslim experience as a weapon to sort of advance, draconian policies that fit our objective, which is really, look, in a communist country where the people have no agency and have no rights, you can do that, right? In terms of, being in line with the theoretical precepts of that country. In a communist country, you don't have citizens, you have subjects that have no rights. But if a country claims to be a democracy like the United States, like Canada, like France, and like India, then individuals have to have rights, right? In liberalism and civil liberties are a natural emanation of democracy. Now, if you are saying that this segment of the population, Muslim women, do not have not only a right, but a fundamental right, which is the free exercise of religion. Religious freedom is as fundamental as any right, right? It's as tantamount, as free speech. It's as tantamount as the right to vote, so forth and so on. So if you're denying women this right to practice their religious freedom in line with their religious worldview, then you are essentially admitting that you are not a full-fledged and functioning democracy. Based on this narrative that it is our objective to save Muslim women, and we all know that that isn't the objective of the BJP regime. We all know that that isn't the objective of the Trump regime. We all know that that isn't the objective of Macron or Le Pen, whoever comes next in France.
Okay, there's often an argument that and bear with me when I say that, but there's an argument, especially here in India and of course elsewhere in the world, that Muslims are in fact intolerant and unwilling to assimilate in the society that they're living in. And in the name of secularism, we've seen majority governments in India also coming up with policies which were frankly for one religion, targeted towards one religion, and they were called out for appeasing that religion. And so that's happening from France to Kerala. Now there is a backlash that we are seeing even in India and in Sweden and in Sri Lanka towards those governments and towards those policies. What would you say to those people who say that for far too long we have tried to appease a certain community, but that hasn't really helped?
Well, that logic is flawed on on a range of lines, but two fundamental lines that I'll address right here. Number one, appease a religious faction. That sort of language and that sort of framing perpetuates the notion that Muslims are foreign, right? In France, we're talking about Muslim citizens. And as a consequence of citizenship, they have the right to theoretically have the right to practice the religion in line with, the trilogy of virtues that, make up France, right? Equality, fraternity, and whatever the third one is. These are citizens in India, right? Muslims are citizens in India. They're indigenous. They're native to that land. They've been there before India became a sovereign nation. So this classification of them as a external foreign group that is being placated and appeased by the government is built upon not only flawed but bigoted grounds. Second, it isn't the government's business how an individual expresses and espouses their religious views, right? Religion is as private a right as any. Right? The way an individual wants to express his or her religious views, whether it's Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Jainism, whatever it is an individual matter. It's an individual enterprise. Whether a Muslim woman wants to wear the hijab or not wear the hijab is only her business, right? It is not the business of her community members. It is not the business of her imam, and it is surely not the business of, a prime minister or a politician. Who is, again, and let's be honest, these arguments are disingenuous, right? So the only reason that BJP leadership or conservative leadership here in the States are saying we have to appease Muslims and essentially pass these laws that protect them, we've been doing this for a long time, that isn't genuine. That isn't what's actually going on. What is going on is they're using that narrative to further their political aim, which is to police and persecute Muslims. And they do that by virtue, they do that fundamentally by policing the bodies of Muslim women. Muslim women are oftentimes the first and the primary victims of state-sponsored Islamophobic policy.
But Professor, for a very long time, secular left-leaning governments have in fact come up with policies that many thought of as policies that were favorable to a certain faction, particularly the religious minority. If I give you an example of India, for example, the Congress government for far too long has been called out for coming up with policies that are left-leaning and pro-Muslims. And therefore, there has been a growing backlash towards these governments, because many blame these governments for rising fundamentalism in secular countries like India. What do you say to those people who say it is because of these left-leaning governments that there is rise of fundamentalism in countries like India?
Well, I would ask them for examples of laws that facilitate or that afford greater rights to Muslims. I can't think of any in the United States. I can't think of a single law in the United States or in France or even in India. I'm not an expert on India, but I closely follow what's happening in India. Politically speaking, and I've done so for many years now. I can't think of a single law that a liberal or democratic government has enacted in the last 10 years that has afforded greater latitude or extended greater rights
Mhm.
to
I'll give you an
Muslims.
example. I'll give
Yeah,
you an example, Professor. And this is something that, because as a journalist, I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of Muslim women in
sure.
India. We're talking about instant triple talaq. And you, as you must be aware, the Congress regime in this country has for
Yeah.
far too long, not supported instant triple talaq because they thought that this would result in losing their Muslim vote bank. But BJP comes to power and instantly there's a law against Muslim, against triple talaq, instant triple talaq. And that many Muslim women have in fact favored. They have come out and open and said, we really support this because for far too long, we were in fact, at the receiving end of our husbands' torture or instant, messages over mails or messages that where they would say talaq, talaq, talaq 3 times, and that's
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I think you got a critic in the house with the dog barking.
I do. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry
No,
about
no,
that.
no. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah. So, that would be classified, I guess, as like a secular feminist policy or law that is empowering women to get divorced in ways that is easier against Sharia law. Now, is that extending greater rights to Muslims as a virtue of extending or leveling the divorce playing field for Muslim women? I don't think so. I mean, that's not benefiting Muslims at large, but it's benefiting Muslim women specifically. And Muslim women, if they favor that kind of law, should be able to sort of, be in alignment with that law. But a democratic country should be able to vote for whatever policies, secular policies, best fit its national vision or societal vision. I can't speak for Muslim women. I'm not a Muslim woman. But if Muslim women want to favor a law of that kind, then so be it.
Right. A question that perhaps comes to every person's mind is that are Muslims easy target for different countries around the world? And the reasons perhaps that's given by a lot of people is that they may not be as integrated and they remain segregated in many countries, including India. Is that something you agree with? What exactly is the reason would you accord for Muslims being easy target around the world?
A range of reasons. Again, I go back to the American War on Terror, where you had this conflation of terrorism with Muslim identity, the idea that conspicuous, invisible expressions of Muslim identity are tantamount to suspicion of terrorism or the possible engagement with terrorism. And that is my basic definition of what Islamophobia is. And I think beyond that, what really menaces governments across the world with regard to Muslims is, especially in, and I hate using the language, but developing countries, right? In places like the United States or in Europe, religion is by and large on the decline. These societies are becoming, more secular by the day. And in some respects, they're becoming more anti-religion by the day. In places like France, it's Scandinavia, the UK, coastal America, big coastal American cities, places like LA, San Francisco, New York, Washington, DC, are becoming very, very secular and in some respects oppositional to religion. So when that is the landscape and the only religion that is growing, right, in terms of adherents and followers is Islam, right, that goes against the sort of normative and cultural trajectory of society at large. Second, Muslims I'm not trying to, paint a generalization, but Muslims are very communal, right? They like to live amongst one another in concentrated communities for a range of practical purposes, right? Because that's where the masjid is located. That's where you have halal restaurants, halal butcheries. And as a consequence of being very communal and being very concentrated, they become very conspicuous and very identifiable to populist politicians who want to scapegoat them for a range of reasons. That's a second reason. I think a third reason is even beyond the war on terror, even in places like India, right? You've had these long-standing narratives where Christianity tied to the Crusades, rooted in the Crusades, right, has always envisioned and imagined Islam as being the natural rival, right, the civilizational antithesis. This is the language of Edward Said, who wrote this landmark book Orientalism. In places like India, there's still very ripe and fresh memory of the partition, right? Where there is a longstanding religious tension and rivalry between Hindus and Muslims and the other religious minorities in the subcontinent. So all of these things come together, make it easy for governments to lock down in and to home in on Muslims as a natural rival and a natural enemy to be cast out and then demonized.
Sorry about that. The social media version of it is that in Israel, it's Muslim versus Jews. In Myanmar, it's Muslim versus Buddhists. In India, it's Muslim versus Hindus. In Europe, it's Muslim versus Christians. So the argument therefore goes is that Muslims are the ones in conflict with everyone. At least that's the social media perception of it. So it must be their fault. So how do you answer to those arguments that when parallels and binaries are drawn on social media, at least by people who are supporters of the fringe element or of the ruling dispensation in these countries, how do you really break it down for these people?
Well, those aren't arguments. Those are platitudes.
That argument is that it's the Muslims who are in conflict with everyone in every country.
Yeah, but that isn't an argument. That's a platitude, right? That isn't a substantive argument. The reality, social media is a place for, I wouldn't even call it engagement, but kind of vapid stupidity. These are polemics. These are platitudes that when you break them down, let's break those down really carefully, right? So in Israel, it's Jews versus Muslims. No, it isn't. No, this is not a religious issue by any means, right? I think that it's a Zionist regime. It's a Zionist government, and Zionism is a secular movement that looks to create a homeland for Jews, right? Not specifically not Jews at large, but primarily Ashkenazi or European Jews. Israeli Jewish society is deeply stratified along racial lines. And the villain of Zionism, right, the target of Zionism isn't Muslims, it's Palestinians. Palestinians happen to be both Muslim and Christian, right? The journalist who was killed weeks ago, Shireen Abu Akleh, was a Palestinian Christian, right? She wasn't killed because she was Christian. She wasn't killed because she was perceived to be Muslim. She was killed because she was Palestinian. So once you break down a platitude like that, you see that we're not talking about religion. Let's move on to Myanmar. Muslims are in conflict with Buddhists. No, they're not in conflict with Buddhists. Muslims are an ethnic minority. Rohingya are an ethnic religious minority in that country who have been genocided, who have been ethnically cleansed. That is not a conflict, right? A conflict presumes that we have a symmetrical, equal contest between two individuals. That is not the case. If you take a professional cricket player who's playing at the highest strata of the sport in India and pick out a poor, vulnerable young teenager from the poorest ghetto in Delhi and expect him to compete with that professional, that is not a competition. That is not a context, right? That is exploitation and domination. What's happening in Myanmar is ethnic cleansing. The other examples you cited, again, are not conflicts. What was the other one you cited? Let me break it down.
Europe.
Okay, Europe. Let's look at France, for instance, right? Which is sort of like the vanguard case study of Islamophobia in Europe. It's Islam against
Christians.
Secularism in France. Why are Muslims marginalized and cast as second and third class citizens in France, right? If you were to pose that question, if you were to engage in nuanced conversation with these individuals making these platitudes on social media and really break them down, you'd find that Muslims who are largely North African in France, right, who are living in these disaffected banlieues on the outskirts of cities like Paris and Lyon and Marseille and so forth and so on. These are the progeny, these are the third, fourth, and fifth generation of colonized people in places like Algeria, right? Algeria was a colonial project of the French government. And when you colonize a country, guess what happens? The colonized come back to the colonial regime for jobs because their country has been sucked out of any resources. That was the case, mind you, of what happened in the Indian subcontinent after England colonized the Indian subcontinent for a long time, right? It's no mere coincidence that there's a large number of Indians and Pakistanis living in places like London and cities and towns across India today Because one thing that happens after colonialism is that the victims of colonization migrate and resettle into the colonial country for jobs, for opportunities, and for education. And that's what's happening in France. Again, I think that social media is a space for convenience. I use it as a educational tool, but it's also a hub for stupidity, right? Where there's little interrogation and little nuanced analysis to combat these kind of platitudes, which are not arguments. Do not confuse platitudes for arguments.
Mm-hmm. But for a layperson on social media, it may be a platform for stupidity, but I suppose for a layperson on social media, it's important to perhaps break these concepts down so as to make them understand better, as what you pointed, that these are platitudes, but not essentially substantial arguments, but simple platitudes, simple arguments that are given to have conversations and perhaps deride people of their rightful sort of ownership. So I think it's important, therefore, to also make these people understand, because that remains our target audience. But to move on from here, I want you to essentially go back to your home country, which is the US, and talk about how much things have changed since 2001. We, as someone, as a foreigner like me, I have for a very long time only seen movies, documentaries about the excesses on Muslim minorities in US. Have things changed now that it's been about 2 decades since the terror attack? Have things moved forward? Are Muslims today gaining their rightful position, the rightful respect that they deserve in the US society? Have things turned around?
I think things have changed for the positive on a number of fronts, but in some respects, things have changed the same, right? I'm somebody who by natural orientation is somewhat of I try to be as optimistic as possible, and I try to look for signs of progress, at least incremental progress. And there are signs for incremental progress. You're seeing Muslims, Muslim American leadership become more visible in political enterprises, in government. There are 2 Muslim American female congresswomen in Congress in Washington, D.C. I think younger Muslims are becoming more economically and academically upwardly mobile, becoming, lawyers and doctors and professors and, fixtures in the media context. We have people like Ayman Muhyiddin and Mahdi Hassan who are on, prominent news stations. And I think there's also greater recognition on the part of private and public institutions in the United States to acknowledge Islamophobia as a bona fide form of racial and religious bigotry, especially after Trump, right? Because I think one good thing Trump did in the long arc of fighting against racial injustice is to demonstrate by indisputable sort of evidence that Islamophobia is a form of religious and racial hatred that we have to contend with. And as a consequence of that, I think that we have to be just objective and say that there has been progress. And I think there has been progress on that front. I think in areas where there's concern, I would say, is that Islamophobia in the United States isn't going anywhere. It's adapting, it's fluidly readjusting, and politicians are always going to look toward it as a useful tool to propel their own political careers. Specifically individuals on the right? I'm talking about conservatives or Republicans here in the United States. In the same way that Muslims will be scapegoated in places like India, politicians here will look towards scapegoating Muslims as a way to advance their own political careers and objectives too. So it's not going away in that regard. And what really frightens me as an academic and as just broadly a Muslim American is that it only takes one attack by a Muslim. It only takes one vile act by a Muslim actor to sort of reignite and to re-intensify the scare tactics that have been used for the last 20 years. It doesn't take much.
From your own personal experience, Professor, I want to understand how is Islamophobia today in US sort of a hindrance in your daily life, common life? Do you have some personal anecdotes that you can share with us growing up? How difficult or easy were things for you? I suppose they were difficult. How difficult were things for you growing up as a American Muslim? And have things turned around? Have things changed now? Are they better, or are you just more used to now, and do you answer people back better, or have things really changed?
Yeah, I think, things have changed for me, right? I mean, on a number of fronts, because I'm sort of a leading, I guess, expert and thinker on Islamophobia. So I know how to respond to these platitudes and arguments that are made against Muslims in in an effective way. But I think growing up, yeah, there were definitely challenges in a range of ways, whether it was, just fearing for family members, especially, my mother or my sister or my nieces who wear the hijab when they left the home during moments of crisis, that kind of concern. Second, concern against Islamophobic policy, or what I call structural Islamophobia. Things like surveillance, things like your bank account being tracked or travel being tracked. Going to the airport for me still today is always stressful because of being interrogated and being stopped for secondary and third level inspection. I will say this though, and I think that it's important to sort of layer Islamophobia with gender. That for me, being a brown Muslim male in the United States, unless somebody knows me or knows my name, they may likely not know that I'm Muslim. But for a Muslim woman or a Muslim man who expresses his Muslim religiosity in ways that are visible, it's more difficult for them, right? A Muslim man, for instance, wears a thobe and has a beard, or a Muslim woman who wears a hijab or a niqab. Their experience with daily Islamophobia is going to be a lot more pointed than somebody like mine, who kind of travel through the world as being religiously ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. Right. A lot of people would say the reason why that has happened is because Muslims, unfortunately, have been a security threat in the past. You've seen more Muslims as terrorists than Christians as terrorists. Is there any factual accuracy to that statement? Is there any factual accuracy when arguments are made that more Muslims are perhaps terrorists than Christians or Buddhists or Hindus?
Yeah. Well, again, that is I'm a professor, right? So my job is to, beyond political ideology, is to educate my students to have sound reasoning when they analyze a statement, and then draw a conclusion based on that reasoning and based on that evidence. Now, what you've just stated is, again, a platitude based on an ambiguous and political definition of what terrorism is. Now, I would ask the person asking that question is, how would you define terrorism, right? And if their definition is, sort of like facially or religiously neutral, then the definition of terrorism should be something like an act of mass violence that is motivated by some sort of political objective. That is terrorism. And if that is the definition of terrorism, then guess what? The vast majority of terror acts have not been committed by Muslims. That would include the actions of governments of a whole array of political structure and designation, right? We would classify the actions of the Buddhist government in Myanmar as terrorism. We definitely classify the unjust wars launched by the United States in places like Iraq as state-sponsored terrorism, which resulted in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of deaths, which would alone supersede and trump the number of deaths committed by the entire aggregation of Muslim terrorists. However, if we take the political definition of terrorism that has been disseminated and established by the War on Terror, which conflates Islam with terrorism, and only expressions of terrorism can be committed by Muslims, then yes, but that's the great lie of the War on Terror, is that we only see terrorism through the prism of Muslim identity. However, if we're intelligent and make sound analysis, we know that terrorism, again, is mass violence committed by political ideology. And look at the United States today. We've had how many mass shootings by white supremacists in the last several weeks, right? And guess what? This is not by any means a novel phenomenon. This wave of white supremacist shooters is not new in the United States. Before this recent string, we had killings by people like Dylan Roof, what's the fellow's name? Stephen Paddock in Las Vegas, school shootings seemingly every week that are not committed by Muslims. They're committed by largely white Christian men. So if we're going to be objective and
Not even
neutral,
classified as terrorist acts, by the way, is our understanding.
newly classified as terrorist acts, mind you, under the Biden administration. That wasn't the case beforehand, right? They were classified as acts of mass violence. So no, the response to that question, and it's a resounding no, is that the vast majority of acts of terror committed in the United States are by white, male, largely Christian men, and across the world are not by Muslims. But again, I'm not saying that as a Muslim. I'm saying that as a law professor who tries to analyze these arguments based on evidence and based on objective and neutral analysis.
So do you think that perhaps there's a need to tweak the definition of terrorism? Because for far too long, it's been very skewed and it's been very favorable to the majority. Because at least in India, the definition seems to be very skewed and it's not what you rightfully said is the act of violence against mass majority. It is in fact fringe violence that happens every now and then, in which you have a member of sometimes a Dalit, a Christian, or one of the minority groups in India, not perhaps a Hindu, who's often classified as a terrorist.
Well, can I ask you a question?
Do you think we need to change perhaps the definition of terrorism as we see today?
No, I don't think so. I think that the legal definitions of terrorism, I think there are 20 some here in the United States, are pretty sound. Again, they're basically, and my guess is that the formal definitions of terrorism on the civil books or even the criminal books in places like India, I haven't studied them, would be facially or religiously neutral. They're essentially there are varying definitions, but again, they have two basic elements to the definitions. Again, an act of mass violence that is driven by some sort of political motive, right? Or a political ideology. That is the definition of terrorism. I think that definition of terrorism is just fine. Now, the issue is not the definition. The issue is how it's being functionally enforced by governments, whether it be politicians or law enforcement in these countries. It's always being enforced along political lines. Let me throw it back and ask you a question, if you don't mind. When a mob of young Hindutva men are descending upon a mosque, shouting things like death to Muslims, or say it again? Or
Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram, exactly. When they're shouting that, is that, and then they go on to ransack that mosque and desecrate that mosque, and then punch and kick and accost anybody that they perceive to be Muslims. Is that an act of terrorism?
Well, it should absolutely classify as an act of terrorism.
Why so?
Well, because a group of people are committing violence against another community. I think that should suffice. And that should fall within the definition of terrorism.
Exactly. So we've met, let's take it by, let's conduct a legal analysis, right? So we've met the threshold of mass violence, right? By virtue of desecration of a holy site, a mosque, and then let's say hypothetically that 20 people have been injured and 2 have been killed. So we've met the threshold of mass violence. And second, we've met the threshold or mandate of political ideology, because by virtue of them saying these things en route to ransacking and vandalizing the mosque, Jai Shri Ram, death to all Muslims, that is expression of a political ideology, and a cogent political ideology, which is Hindutva supremacy. And the same is true. Let's revise that hypothetical and say that it's a Muslim mob, right? Walking toward a synagogue or a Christian church in France, right? And they're shouting Allahu Akbar and death to all Christians, and then they walk into the church and they ransack that church. That is terrorism, right? In both cases, it is terrorism because we have 2 actors, 2 mobs, which are spewing political hatred and engaging in mass violence. So I don't care. Like our definitions of terrorism should not care as to the character and identity of the subjects being analyzed. It is just the actions and the mandate that an ideology is fueling and driving their violence. So the definition doesn't need to be changed. It's the enforcement and the analysis that needs to be changed.
Yeah. But it's not that simple, is it, Professor? Because even in India, for that matter, when there's a group of people chanting Jai Shri Ram, walking towards a mosque, you have the other group of people who then take out their guns, and then there's a skirmish between the 2 communities. That essentially wouldn't be called terrorism, right? Because that's essentially what happened in India as well.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't called. And again, the intellectual exercise is distinct from the political sort of analysis, right? I think what I'd encourage, your viewers to understand is it is terrorism. Like inherently and innately, that is terrorism. Now, what happens in India is because the political objectives of that mob align with the state objectives, right? And in fact, are being emboldened by Modi and the BJP regime. It's in lockstep alignment with the regime. Of course, the regime and local law enforcement who, oftentimes stand aside and enable these mobs to attack Muslims are not going to call it terrorism, which is dishonest, right? To say the least, because it aligns, because it fits with their political view, with their political mandate, which is to persecute Muslims. But it still is terrorism, right?
And how do you see the Indian government's acts? Because I think you've talked about that as well. For the first time, in fact, in last 7 years of the Modi government, there was an attempt made to punish those indulging in anti-Muslim rhetoric. How do you see these small but significant acts, I would say? Because I haven't seen, at least in my career as a journalist in India, but the ruling government so far as to disassociate itself with its own party members and let them go when they are indulging in hate narrative.
Look, I think that, what happened yesterday with governments like, I think it was spurred on by Qatar, and then Kuwait followed suit, and then Iran, and then Saudi Arabia last made a formal statement and reprimand of the ambassadors, the Indian ambassadors in their country for the statements made by the two BJP leaders. I think that it can't stop there, because one of the encouraging things is that it showed that these four countries, and they're not just any four countries, three of them are very wealthy, right? So there's an economic sort of motive behind why these two BJP leaders were fired, is because it wasn't Lebanon, it wasn't Yemen who made these, poor Muslim majority or Arab countries making these statements. It was some of the wealthiest governments in the world, which shows that, in the sort of like language and spirit of realpolitik, if powerful economic countries took a stance against hate, then that could police and sort of, make BJP leadership think twice about the things they say and the things that they do. So I'm hoping what we saw yesterday with these governments finally take a stand doesn't stop and is only the beginning of these governments, but also societies. I saw how in countries like Qatar and the UAE, on Twitter, for instance, and I participated in it, there was a move to boycott Indian products. We all know, all of us who study, whether it's political science or, global politics by the day, that one way to sanction a government is through economic means. And if the Modi regime realizes that there's going to be economic costs with members of his party saying very violent, hateful things, then my guess is that it's going to stop. Not stop entirely, but slow down.
Mm-hmm. But many would say, Professor, that this was perhaps too little, too less. Came very late, 7 years on. There's been anti-Muslim rhetoric now, persistent, perseverant for the last 7 years. And finally, one small action perhaps is not going to help it. What do you tell the Indian Muslims? Because many of them are now trying to bring attention to their plight in India for many, many years now. Finally got a chance where at least, wealthy countries in the Arab world finally listened to them. Pressure was built. What do you tell Indian Muslims today? How do they find relief? What should they do next? What should be the next, perhaps, big steps that they need to take in order to bring more equality, per se, and more attention to their plight?
I agree with that. I think it is too little, too late in many regards. I mean, what's been happening with Islamophobia in India has been the case for at least 8 years now, since the election of Modi as prime minister of the country. And I think that, look, I wish these governments would have said and did something when the CAA was enacted, when the hijab bans in Karnataka were being enacted, when when Trump visited India a couple of years ago and you had those really violent riots take place in places like Delhi and across the country. I wish that these governments would have said and did something. It might have saved the lives of hundreds of Muslims, right? It might have saved the lives of and protected Muslim communities when Modi scapegoated Muslims for the outbreak of coronavirus in India a couple of years back. So I do agree with Indian Muslims when they say that this is coming far too late in some regard. The reality is this, I sort of, part of the blame, and I'm older now, so I really struggle with this, is how can the world be so disconnected during a time where we have powerful tools like social media? The reality is that Americans don't care about anything that doesn't take place outside of America, and aren't conscious and cognizant of what's happening in India. And that's true across the world, is that there's so much ignorance and apathy as to what's happening in places across the world. Even Muslims don't even even American Muslims, with few exception, are talking about and addressing what's happening with Muslims in India. But the reality is that we have to build discussions like this, transnational intellectual discussion, where we connect what's happening across the world with Islamophobia and with Muslims. We have to have more transnational connections and bonds between advocates that really unify and bond our struggles together. And we have to frame, I think, more, especially for young people in the room, and I say this to my students all the time, is when you think about civil rights or civil liberties in the American context, we have to frame them and understand them in a globalized way, because we live in a globalized world, right? You can't understand Islamophobia as a global phenomenon today if you don't have a strong understanding as to what's happening in India. India, in my opinion, is one of the principal epicenters of global Islamophobia. And what's happening in India is just as, if not more important than what's happening with Islamophobia in the United States or in France. You have to, in order to understand Islamophobia, you got to understand what's happening in India. So if these governments are truly committed, in not only the governments, but the societies in places like Qatar, in the UAE, in Iran, in the United States, in Muslims in France, we can't always look to governments to take action, because governments are self-interested animals. They're interested in their own political and economic interests. Human beings function differently, right? So the onus and the responsibility is on us to not only educate ourselves, but beyond just educating ourselves, is taking the next steps to connecting our experiences and our struggles.
Professor, you talked about transnational unity, but that's very rare, especially among Muslim countries. Why is it rare for Muslim countries to unite? Why is it rare for them to stand up for each other and speak for each other? Because that's not something that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, because it's a myth, right? This whole notion of a transnational political ummah or community, especially with regard to governments, is a myth. Again, I think that people always say this, right? People always say on social media, Professor Khaled Beydoun, you're never critical of your own. You're never critical of Muslims. Well, guess what? If you listen closely to what I say, I am very critical of Muslims. Some of the most vile governments in the world are Muslim majority governments, right? That sort of weaponize and utilize religion as a tool to maintain their authority, to maintain their influence, whether it's Iran or Saudi Arabia. These governments are by no means interested in the welfare of their own citizens, let alone Muslims beyond their countries, right? I don't care that Mecca and Medina are located in Saudi Arabia. In my opinion, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is one of the most vile governments in the world. I think that the government in Iran is one of the more oppressive governments in the world. They use religion as a tool to maintain themselves. Now, if they truly cared about Muslims, right? If these governments kind of practice what they preach and sort of like, practice what they proselytize in terms of using religion as a tool, then they would take some sort of action as to what's happening with Muslims in China, right? But they don't. They would have taken some action to resettle and give safe haven or humanitarian aid to Rohingya Muslims leaving Myanmar, right? They would have taken, let's look at Saudi Arabia. It's decimating and bludgeoning the poorest Arab country in the world, which is Yemen. One statistic that is mind-blowing is 1 child under 5 dies every 15 minutes in Yemen as a consequence of bombing, cholera, COVID, or famine. That is a direct consequence of the specific design of the Saudi Arabian regime to bludgeon that country. So when you look at Muslim governments across the world, with few exception, all of them only care about their self-interest. And when I talk about their self-interest, it's an elite class of people in that country who run those governments who are benefiting from their self-interest, not society at large. So newsflash, Muslim majority governments are never going to come together because they're self-interested, selfish animals that don't care about the interests of Muslims. They care about their own discrete elite interests. If we can record that and then decimate it on social media for those who say that I never critique Muslims, I would love that.
What's the biggest criticism of the Muslim world as you would like to point out today? What's the biggest criticism in your own understanding? What should Muslims change about themselves? Because I'm sure there's always better. There's always something you can do better. There's always room to grow. What is it that Muslims can do perhaps better in the countries that they're living in at this point in time to perhaps ensure more equality, equanimity, and more peace?
Well, look, the first thing is, like, Muslims are by no means monolithic, right? Like there is no singular, homogenous Muslim bloc in any country across the world. Muslims are deeply diverse and heterogeneous along a range of lines: ethnic, racial, sectarian, school of thought. In places like India, you have Salafis and you have Sufis. You have Sunnis and you have Shia. You have individuals who adhere to and practice Islam in a range of ways. So let's demystify this idea that Muslims are a monolithic bloc of any kind. But I think that, and one thing I tell my students and my friends and my family even, is one thing that really plagues not only Muslims but individuals at large is dogma, right? Ideological dogma, to only see the world through one unitary singular lens. I think that, and I'm a Muslim, I'm a believer. I believe in the precepts of Islam. And I think one of the cornerstones of Islam that is, very often overlooked is the sort of like Islamic mandate of critical engagement and nuanced analysis. Think for yourself, right? You have ulama, you have learned individuals who study and then, obviously, provide conclusions on specific issues. But it's a direct dictate from God to think for yourself. And I see Muslims being very dogmatic oftentimes, not thinking for themselves, just doing what, the flock, do. And the beautiful thing about living in a so-called or aspirational democracy is free will, is individual liberty, is you have the right to practice Islam in ways that you see fit. If you're a young Muslim woman and you want to wear the hijab, then guess what? In a democracy, you have the right to do that. If you're a young Muslim person who doesn't want to practice their religion in line with the way your mom or your father or your uncle practices it, guess what? In a democracy, you have a right to do that. So I would encourage young Muslims in countries across the world to really take hold of that Islamic mandate of free will and free thought, and to lead lives in terms of how they see the world individually, and not as a sort of like large block of people, because there is no monolithic block of Muslims anywhere in the world.
All right, Professor Khaled Beydoun, we are going to end it at that. Free will and free thought, those are important expressions in Islam. And I think if you ask the question whether global Islamophobia is real, I think it is. I think we both agree that it is. And I think we've had a wonderful conversation and enlightening me, and I'm sure entire audience here at Argumentative Indian, as to what we can do better as a country, as a global world, as a society, to treat each other better. Thank you so much for your time. It was very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
You too.